For nearly 500 years, one small piece of metal was considered so offensive that some people believed it insulted God himself. Not a weapon, not a dangerous invention. A fork. Today, it sits beside almost every dinner plate on Earth. We use it without thinking. Restaurants provide it automatically. Children learn to eat with one before they even begin school. It feels so natural that it's almost impossible to imagine a meal without one. But for centuries after the fork had already been invented, millions of people refused to touch it. Some called it sinful. Others called it arrogant. Many believed eating with a fork was proof that someone had become spoiled, weak, or dangerously obsessed with luxury. One religious leader even declared that God had already given humanity the perfect eating utensils. They were attached to the ends of your arms. If you wanted to understand why people hated forks so passionately, you first had to understand how almost everyone had eaten for thousands of years before they appeared. The answer was remarkably simple. They used their hands. For most of human history, the human hand was the perfect dining tool. It could tear meat, scoop grains, hold fruit, separate bread, and carry food directly to the mouth with incredible precision. It required no manufacturing, never broke, and was always available. Hunter-gatherers had no need for cutlery. Neither did many of the world's earliest civilizations. In ancient Egypt, workers commonly used flat loaves of bread almost like edible spoons. Thick stews, vegetables, and sauces were lifted using pieces of bread that were eaten afterward. Nothing was wasted. Across Mesopotamia, people gathered around shared bowls using bread or their fingers to collect food. Meals were communal and everyone reached into the same dishes. To them, this wasn't poor manners. It was perfectly normal. Even among the ancient Greeks, elegant banquets often involved eating with the fingers. Bread remained one of the most useful eating tools ever invented. Soft foods could be scooped, meat could be grasped directly, oils and sauces soaked naturally into the bread instead of remaining on the plate. The Romans developed an even more elaborate dining culture. Wealthy Romans reclined on couches while servants carried course after course into enormous dining halls. They possessed knives for cutting meat and spoons for soups, eggs, and desserts. But forks? Almost none. At least not for eating. The Romans certainly knew what forks were. Archaeologists have discovered small two-pronged bronze forks throughout the Roman world. But these were kitchen tools. They helped cooks lift meat from boiling pots or hold food over fires. They rarely appeared at the dining table. The reason was surprisingly practical. Roman meals often involved large cuts of roasted meat placed in the center of the table. Servants sliced them into smaller pieces before guests ate. Once food became bite-sized, fingers worked perfectly well. Why invent another utensil? For centuries, nobody saw a reason. The first true dining forks probably appeared much farther east, inside the wealthy courts of the Byzantine Empire. By the 7th century, noble families in Constantinople had begun using elegant golden and silver forks during formal banquets. Unlike Roman kitchen forks, these were specifically designed for eating. They were beautiful, delicate, decorated with jewels and precious metals. Most had only two long, slender prongs. Their purpose wasn't merely practical. They announced refinement, status, sophistication. Owning a golden fork was a statement. It told every guest that the person using it belonged to one of the richest societies on Earth. Then, around the year 1004, something happened that changed the history of the fork forever. A Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulos traveled to Venice to marry the son of an important Venetian nobleman. She brought with her magnificent clothing, rare spices, luxurious jewelry, and one tiny object almost nobody in Italy had ever seen before: a golden dining fork. At the wedding feast, the princess calmly picked up her food using the elegant little instrument instead of her fingers. The guests stared. Many were horrified. Some whispered that the behavior seemed unnatural. Others thought it looked absurdly extravagant. One church leader condemned the practice almost immediately. According to later accounts, Saint Peter Damian argued that God had already provided human beings with fingers for eating. Replacing them with tiny, golden forks represented pride rather than necessity. When the princess later died from illness, some religious figures even claimed her death was divine punishment for such excessive luxury. Today, the story sounds unbelievable. Yet it reflected something much larger. Medieval Europe deeply distrusted unnecessary luxury. Anything that appeared too elegant risked attracting suspicion. The fork became one more symbol of foreign extravagance arriving from the wealthy Byzantine East. And Europe wasn't ready to accept it. For the next several centuries, most people continued eating exactly as their ancestors always had, with their hands, while the little fork waited patiently for history to change its mind. For nearly 500 years, the fork remained one of Europe's most misunderstood inventions. Not because it didn't work, because people believed nobody actually needed it. Imagine walking into a medieval banquet carrying a golden fork. The reaction would probably not be admiration. It would be suspicion. Many guests would quietly wonder why anyone needed such a strange object when perfectly good fingers already existed. In medieval Europe, eating with your hands wasn't considered rude. It was considered proper. Children were taught exactly which fingers to use. Only the right hand touched food. The left hand remained reserved for less pleasant tasks because toilet paper did not yet exist. Good manners required taking only the pieces closest to you, never reaching across the table, and wiping greasy fingers on bread or linen napkins provided by the host. Meals followed strict rules. The fork simply wasn't one of them. Instead, almost every person carried a personal knife. Unlike today, knives were not placed on the dining table by the host. Guests brought their own. The knife served dozens of purposes throughout the day. It cut food, prepared firewood, opened packages, protected travelers against thieves. Then, at dinner, it sliced meat into bite-sized pieces before people picked them up with their fingers. The system worked surprisingly well. For centuries, nobody saw a reason to change it. Yet while much of Europe rejected forks, one region slowly began embracing them: Italy. The great trading cities of Venice, Florence, and Genoa maintained constant contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Merchants imported silk, spices, perfumes, porcelain, and countless luxury goods that fascinated wealthy Italians. Among those imports, the fork quietly returned. At first, it remained a curiosity found only inside the homes of noble families. Early Italian forks looked nothing like modern ones. Most had only two thin prongs. They weren't designed for large pieces of meat. They were perfect for something becoming increasingly popular across Italy. Pasta. Fresh noodles coated with oil or sauce proved surprisingly difficult to eat neatly using fingers alone. The small two-pronged fork suddenly became remarkably useful. It wasn't invented for pasta, but pasta helped make the fork famous. Italian nobles soon realized another advantage. The fork kept expensive gloves clean. Rich fabrics remained free from grease. Elaborate lace cuffs no longer became stained during meals. For aristocrats obsessed with appearance, this mattered enormously. The fork became a symbol of refinement. Not everyone admired that refinement. Outside Italy, many Europeans continued mocking the strange new utensil. English travelers visiting Italy often laughed at what they described as excessive table manners. Some claimed Italians had become so delicate that they feared touching their own food. One English writer joked that Italians behaved as though their fingers had become too precious for ordinary meals. Perhaps the most famous critic was the English traveler Thomas Coryate. During a journey through Italy in the early 17th century, Coryate observed Italians using forks regularly at dinner. Curious, he tried eating with one himself. He actually liked it. When he returned to England, he brought forks home and encouraged others to use them. Instead of thanking him, people laughed. Friends mocked him relentlessly. Some even nicknamed him Furcifer, a play on the Latin word for fork that also meant rogue or scoundrel. Imagine becoming famous simply because you suggested people eat differently. History has a strange sense of humor. Gradually, however, something unexpected happened. European dining itself began changing. Meals became more elaborate. Tables featured multiple courses instead of one large communal dish. Individual plates became increasingly common. People no longer reached together into the same bowl. Instead, each guest received separate portions. That small change transformed everything. The fork suddenly became far more practical. As etiquette evolved, touching food directly with bare hands began appearing less refined. The wealthy embraced the new fashion first. Then royalty followed. One royal family after another adopted forks during formal banquets. French nobles copied Italian customs after Catherine de' Medici married into the French royal family during the 16th century. Along with chefs, recipes, and elaborate dining traditions, Italian table manners, including the fork, slowly entered French aristocratic life. France quickly became Europe's center of fashion. What French nobles considered elegant, the rest of Europe eventually imitated. Even then, acceptance remained painfully slow. Throughout the 17th century, countless households still considered forks unnecessary luxuries. Many families owned only one or two, often reserved for special guests. Ordinary meals continued exactly as they always had. Hands, bread, knife, spoon. The fork remained optional, until one surprising invention quietly changed everything. Mass production. Because once factories learned how to manufacture thousands of identical forks instead of crafting each one by hand, the strange little luxury from Byzantium would finally become an object found on nearly every table in the world. By the 18th century, the fork had finally survived centuries of ridicule. But it still wasn't common. For most ordinary families across Europe, a fork remained an expensive piece of metal that served little purpose beyond impressing wealthy dinner guests. Everything changed with one invention: the factory. Before the Industrial Revolution, every fork was made by hand. A blacksmith heated iron until it glowed bright orange, hammered each prong individually, shaped the handle, polished the surface, and carefully balanced the entire utensil so it could actually be used. Even a simple fork required hours of skilled labor. That craftsmanship came at a price. Most working families simply couldn't afford complete sets of matching cutlery. Many households owned only a single fork, sometimes none at all. Meals continued exactly as they had for centuries, with fingers, knives, and spoons. Then factories transformed everything. Steam-powered machines could stamp identical forks from sheets of metal within seconds. Mass production dramatically lowered prices. Suddenly, something that had once belonged only to kings, merchants, and wealthy nobles became affordable for ordinary workers. The fork quietly entered millions of homes. But another revolution was happening at the same time. Dining itself was changing. Restaurants began appearing across Europe and North America. Hotels served travelers from every social class. Railway dining cars offered meals to passengers crossing entire countries. Large public banquets became increasingly common. Using the same table manners created order. The fork became part of a universal language of dining. Schools even began teaching children how to use cutlery correctly. Not because forks were absolutely necessary, because they had become a symbol of education and good manners. By the 19th century, manufacturers realized one fork could no longer do every job. Different foods required different designs. Dinner forks, salad forks, dessert forks, fish forks, pastry forks, serving forks, carving forks. Suddenly, one simple invention had evolved into an entire family of utensils. Victorian households sometimes owned dozens of different forks, each designed for a specific purpose. Ironically, people who had once refused to use even one fork were now expected to know which of 6 different forks belonged to each course of a formal dinner. History has a remarkable sense of irony. Then came another breakthrough: stainless steel. Before its invention, ordinary iron forks rusted easily, while silver required constant polishing and remained far too expensive for many families. In the early 20th century, stainless steel transformed cutlery forever. It resisted rust, required little maintenance, lasted for decades, and remained affordable. For the first time in history, billions of people could own durable forks that looked almost identical to those used in fine restaurants. The fork had finally become ordinary. Yet modern science would eventually reveal something our ancestors never understood. Using a fork wasn't only cleaner, it was healthier. Sharing food with bare hands had always allowed bacteria to spread more easily between people, especially during large communal meals. As scientists discovered germs during the 19th century, personal utensils suddenly made far more sense than they ever had before. Without intending it, humanity had spent centuries arguing against an invention that quietly reduced the spread of disease. Today, forks are so common that we rarely notice them. They sit inside kitchen drawers, appear automatically in restaurants, travel inside lunchboxes, cross oceans aboard airplanes. Billions of people use them every single day without giving them a second thought. That may be the greatest success any invention can achieve. It becomes invisible. The same happened with toothbrushes, shoes, umbrellas, toilet paper, coffee. Objects that once seemed strange eventually become so ordinary that future generations cannot imagine life without them. The fork belongs on that list. For nearly 500 years, people insisted fingers were good enough. Some believed forks offended God. Others thought they made people weak. Many simply laughed at anyone brave enough to use one. Today, those arguments sound almost unbelievable. Because history rarely remembers the people who mocked progress. It remembers the inventions that quietly changed everyday life forever. The next time you pick up a fork before dinner, pause for a moment. You're holding an object that survived centuries of ridicule, crossed empires, defied religious criticism, outlived kings, transformed dining etiquette, and eventually found its place on nearly every table on Earth. For thousands of years, humanity believed the fork was unnecessary. Now, most of us wouldn't know how to eat a plate of pasta without it. Sometimes the inventions that change civilization aren't the loudest. They're the ones quietly waiting on the dinner table.